They said her stories were too gruesome to be written by a woman, pages soaked with madness, blood, and whispered prophecy. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a reclusive horror novelist whose tales of small-town killings seemed like dark fiction. Until those very murders began happening, word for word, just as she had written them. Townsfolk burned her books, the police called her a witch, and then she vanished, leaving behind one unfinished manuscript said to describe her own death, written months before she disappeared. But here's the part that chills historians most. Every last line eventually came true. The rediscovery of Eleanor Vance's banned novels began as little more than an archival curiosity, one of those quiet accidents of history that seems meaningless until it isn't. In 1978, a graduate student named Miriam Cole from Boston University was cataloging decaying records in the cellar of the Waltham Public Library, a building long rumored to be haunted by the smell of mildew and forgotten words. It was there, behind a false wall of warped shelving, that she found a sealed wooden crate covered in layers of dust and tied with iron wire. Inside were 6 leather-bound manuscripts, each embossed with the initials EV in flaking gold leaf. The pages were brittle, handwritten in sweeping Victorian cursive, and the air that escaped the box was heavy, tinged with the faint sweetness of mold and candle wax. Miriam initially believed she had stumbled upon a collection of unpublished Gothic fiction, perhaps some unknown admirer of Poe or Radcliffe. But as she read, she began to notice something deeply wrong. Each story was dated 1899, 1901, 1903, and each revolved around a series of murders that seemed too specific, too vividly described, to be purely imagined. Victims' names, locations, and even the placement of furniture or the color of a shawl matched historical crime reports from the same regions and years. At first, Miriam thought she was witnessing eerie coincidences. Then she realized that in every single case, Eleanor's stories had been written before the murders occurred. When word of the discovery reached the local press, it stirred brief excitement. "Lost works of Victorian horror authoress unearthed," one headline proclaimed. But soon the tone darkened. Archivists refused to handle the books after a string of bizarre accidents. A fire that erupted in the reading room without an obvious source, a librarian who claimed she heard pages whispering her name, and another who suffered a breakdown after reading Eleanor's short story, The Widow's Window. The library sealed the crate again, and the manuscripts were quietly transferred to the state archives, where they lay unexamined for decades. But it was Miriam's personal notes that reignited interest years later. In her journal, she described a growing sense that the stories were alive. When she cross-referenced the dates in the margins with newspaper records, she found details so disturbingly accurate they bordered on prophetic. One murder in particular, described in the Willow Confession, mirrored a real event from 1903 in which an entire family was slaughtered beside a creek. Eleanor's description of the crime scene included the exact number of cuts on the victims' bodies, the unique carving on a pocket watch found in the father's hand, and even the final words he allegedly whispered before death. None of those details were ever published in contemporary papers. The deeper Miriam delved, the more she began to sense the outline of a mind that wasn't merely writing fiction, but recording something unseen. Eleanor's prose had a strange rhythm, alternating between lucid narrative and what appeared to be trance-like dictation, paragraphs written in fragmented sentences, as though transcribed from voices speaking in a room beyond time. Some pages bore smeared fingerprints as if someone had tried to tear them away mid-writing. Others had sections blackened with soot or singed at the edges as though deliberately burned. The most unnerving discovery came from a small envelope tucked inside the back cover of the final manuscript. It contained a faded photograph of Eleanor herself, hollow-eyed, standing beside a candlelit writing desk, and a note scrawled on the back that read, "Do not open before the others are found." No one has ever identified who the others were. Some speculate it referred to her remaining unpublished works. Others suspect it meant something far more literal. Miriam Cole left academia soon after. She stopped returning letters and eventually disappeared while researching Vance's home in Essex County. The crate remains in storage to this day, sealed once more, and among the archivists who've handled it, there's a quiet superstition. If you linger too long near Eleanor's manuscripts, you'll start to dream of scenes you've never lived, murders that haven't yet happened, but somehow feel like memories waiting to come true. The pattern of real murders matching Eleanor Vance's fiction emerged slowly, like a nightmare creeping from the corners of reality. It began with whispers in local newspapers during the early 1900s, small-town tragedies that seemed eerily familiar to anyone who had read her first novel, The Willow Confession. In the book, a mother and child are found dead beside a creek, their bodies posed beneath a willow tree, hands clasped as if in prayer. The story's tone was hauntingly gentle, almost compassionate, but the imagery was macabre in its precision. 2 years after the book's release in the nearby town of Ipswich, Massachusetts, a family of 3 was discovered in the exact same tableau. The authorities at the time dismissed any connection to the novel. But when Eleanor's next book, The House That Waited, appeared, and another murder unfolded in perfect detail, skepticism began to erode. Detectives began reading her works as though they were maps to impending crimes. In The House That Waited, she described a scene in which a man is found hanging in his attic, surrounded by mirrors facing inward. A few months later, a carpenter in Salem was discovered in precisely that position, his home staged to reflect the fictional account down to the number of mirrors, 5, each cracked at the corner. The press coined the phrase Vance murders, and the public turned against her. Some accused Eleanor of orchestrating the killings herself, others of consorting with the occult. The police questioned her repeatedly, but she had alibis for every incident. When asked how she could explain the accuracy of her writing, she gave the same answer every time. "They come to me already written." Those words became infamous, printed in newspapers across New England. The idea that a woman could dream murders into existence unsettled everyone, especially in a society where women were expected to remain silent and domestic. But Eleanor didn't just defy expectations, she terrified people. Her stories contained references to obscure local legends, private family feuds, and details that had never been made public. It was as if she had tapped into a consciousness that knew more than it should, a memory that didn't belong to her alone. One of the most unsettling examples was a short story titled Harvest of Bone. It depicted a farmer's wife who discovered her husband's body buried in their own cellar, beneath the newly laid foundation of a barn. 2 months later, an identical crime occurred in rural Maine. Investigators later confirmed that the story had been written and printed before the murder. That discovery changed everything. The Boston police began consulting her books in secret, treating them as prophetic warnings. Notes from one inspector, preserved in a private collection, read, "Her writing knows what is not yet done. We must find who tells her." The pattern wasn't limited to Massachusetts. As her readership grew, so did the reach of the crimes. Chicago, Charleston, even London saw murders eerily mirroring her scenes, though Eleanor never left New England. Some scholars now believe her books may have inspired certain killings, a form of macabre imitation by readers who saw themselves within her pages. But other researchers, studying the chronological order of the murders and the publication of her manuscripts, insist the writing preceded the deaths every single time. The eerie synchronization defied explanation. Even stranger were the marginal notes she left in her drafts, cryptic warnings and corrections added after the murders had occurred. Phrases like "too soon," "not him this time," or "it was supposed to be raining." Forensic experts examining her handwriting decades later found that these additions were written in a different ink, sometimes in a slightly different hand, as though another person had amended her work. One investigator speculated that Eleanor might have suffered from dissociative states, unaware of what she was predicting or causing. But townspeople who knew her spoke of something else. They claimed she was haunted by her own stories, that she feared her words were being stolen as she slept. A neighbor once recounted seeing her bury pages in the snow, muttering that the voices had gone too far. There was no doubt the murders were real, and the stories, every word of them, matched. Whether Eleanor was a prophet, a vessel, or something darker, no one could say. What everyone agreed on was this: after reading her books, the line between imagination and evidence no longer existed. Eleanor Vance's fascination with death and the unseen began long before she ever put pen to paper. Born in 1865 in Marblehead, Massachusetts, she grew up in a house that seemed designed for silence. Narrow hallways, shuttered windows, and a mother who believed the dead could speak through dreams. Her father, A shipwright-turned invalid spent his final years bedridden, muttering to shadows that no one else could see. By the time Eleanor was 10, she had learned to read the moods of the house the way other children learned to read books. The creak of the stairs, the tick of the mantel clock, the hum of wind through the floorboards, each sound felt alive, whispering things she could almost understand. Her mother, Margaret Vance, was an ardent believer in the spiritualist movement that swept through New England in the late 19th century. Seances were held in their parlor every other Thursday, with guests traveling from as far as Boston to witness Margaret's trance states and table rappings. Eleanor, small and pale, was often kept nearby to channel the energy of the departed. Family accounts suggest that she sometimes spoke in voices that were not her own, reciting fragments of poetry and phrases in languages she had never studied. By the time she turned 16, several spiritualist circles referred to her as a natural medium, though Eleanor herself claimed she never remembered what she said during those nights. When her mother died suddenly in 1884, Eleanor reportedly tried to contact her through automatic writing. The pages she produced over the following months were filled with half-coherent sentences, pleas, apologies, and strange directives that sounded less like messages from her mother and more like confessions from a stranger. One recurring phrase appeared over and over: "Write what you see, before it happens again." Neighbors later recalled how Eleanor began walking the coastline at dawn, murmuring dialogue to herself, describing faces that didn't exist, and sketching the outlines of houses no one recognized. Some of those sketches would later match the settings of her published novels with uncanny precision. By her early 20s, Eleanor had become deeply involved in the Boston Society for Psychical Research, corresponding with scholars and occultists who sought scientific explanations for hauntings and premonitions. She contributed essays under a pseudonym, E.V. Hartwell, arguing that creativity and clairvoyance might spring from the same hidden part of the mind. Her letters reveal a woman torn between fascination and fear, convinced that her imagination was not entirely her own. In one note to a fellow researcher, she wrote, "Sometimes I feel as though the world has already happened and I am merely remembering it in reverse." Those around her began to notice unsettling coincidences. During seances, Eleanor would describe visions of accidents or deaths that later occurred. One evening in 1894, she abruptly ended a session and wept, claiming she saw a carriage overturned in the snow, a child's shoe in the road. 2 days later, a newspaper reported that a local family had perished in exactly that manner. It was after this event that Eleanor stopped participating publicly in seances. Instead, she began writing stories, quietly, obsessively, believing that putting her visions into fiction might contain them, keep them from coming true. Her early drafts, discovered years later, were written in a looping, fevered script, sometimes without punctuation, as though dictated in a rush. Observers described her as serene while writing, almost entranced. Friends said she would sometimes wake from sleep to find entire pages written in her hand that she couldn't remember composing. Her fascination with Victorian spiritualism had evolved into something more dangerous, a conviction that the veil between imagination and fate could be pierced through language itself. In time, that belief became the engine behind her novels. She told one publisher that her books were not fiction, but records of what the world refuses to remember yet. The statement was dismissed as poetic eccentricity at the time. But as history would show, every record she wrote soon found its mirror in real life, as if her fascination with the dead had taught her not just to listen, but to write the future before it arrived. The Mirror Creek murders of 1903 remain one of the most unsettling unsolved cases in Massachusetts history, and the most disturbing link between Eleanor Vance's fiction and real bloodshed. It began in the spring of that year, when a local family, the Harrows, were found dead beside a narrow bend of Mirror Creek, a desolate ribbon of water that wound through the outskirts of Essex County. The father, Thomas Harrow, was a modest carpenter. His wife, Lydia, was known for her charitable work at the parish. Their daughter, Alice, was 8 years old. All three were discovered posed together beneath a drooping willow tree, their hands bound loosely with silk ribbons, as though arranged for a portrait no living soul would ever see. The crime scene baffled authorities. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading to or from the creek despite the damp soil, and no trace of a weapon. The ribbons were tied with meticulous care, and the bodies bore faint marks across the wrists, suggesting they'd been placed there after death. Nearby, investigators found a single candle, half melted, stuck upright in the mud. When they questioned the townspeople, one detail kept resurfacing. The scene was identical to a passage from Eleanor Vance's first novel, The Willow Confession. In the book, a grieving mother returns to the site of her family's drowning to light a candle and beg the creek to give their souls back. The story's final lines describe 3 bodies resting in silence beneath the weeping boughs, hands joined with pale ribbons, as if heaven had tied them together to keep them still. The novel had been published 4 years earlier, and while it sold only modestly, it had developed a small cult following among lovers of Gothic fiction. Now it was suddenly evidence the newspapers went wild. Headlines screamed, "Horror writer predicts grisly family deaths and murder by the book." Reporters swarmed Eleanor's small seaside cottage, demanding answers. She appeared pale, sleep-deprived, and evasive. When one journalist asked if she'd known the Harrows, she replied quietly, "Not yet." That quote appeared in every major Boston paper the next morning, and it sealed her reputation as either a prophet or a killer. The local sheriff, Samuel Breen, ordered an immediate investigation into Eleanor's life. What they found deepened the mystery. Her journal entries from months before the murders contained scattered references to a house by the water, a child with ribbons, and a silence that will not end. The most chilling note, dated February 12, 1903, 2 months before the murders, read simply, "The creek is ready." When questioned about the entry, Eleanor seemed confused, as though hearing about it for the first time. She told investigators that she often wrote down things she saw in dreams, claiming they felt borrowed from somewhere outside her own mind. Despite mounting suspicion, no direct evidence linked her to the Harrows' deaths. She had been seen in Boston at the time of the murders, attending a literary gathering, a fact confirmed by several witnesses. Still, the resemblance between her book and the crime was too precise for comfort. The case soon took on an eerie life of its own. Several of the men who handled the investigation reported strange incidents afterward. Dreams of drowning, the sound of rushing water echoing inside their homes, and in one case, finding damp footprints on their floorboards despite locked doors. Within weeks, the Harrow family's home was abandoned, and the willow tree became a site of grim fascination. Locals swore they saw candlelight flickering there at night, as though someone or something was still visiting. A year later, a local newspaper published an anonymous letter claiming that Eleanor had confessed to a close friend that she'd written The Willow Confession after seeing the murders in a vision years before they happened. No one could prove the letter's authenticity, but its contents aligned disturbingly with Eleanor's own remarks about her work, that she didn't invent her stories, she remembered them. The Mirror Creek murders officially remain unsolved. The case file, still preserved in state archives, contains photographs of the scene and copies of Eleanor's novel, marked up by investigators with red pencil. In one margin, next to the line describing the candle by the creek, an officer had written a single question. Did she light it, or did they make her see it? No one ever found an answer. When police and witnesses described their encounters with Eleanor Vance during the height of the murders, their testimonies read less like standard reports and more like notes from a seance. Every officer who interviewed her seemed to come away shaken, claiming she knew things no living person should. The first such report came from Detective Henry Weller, who questioned Eleanor in April 1903 following the Mirror Creek case. He expected to meet a cunning woman, perhaps manipulative or theatrical, but instead found someone calm, almost detached, sitting by her window with an unlit candle in her hand. When he began listing details of the Harrow family's deaths, she interrupted him mid-sentence and quietly finished his description, including the position of the bodies, the type of knot used on the ribbons, and the exact words etched on the child's locket. None of those details had been made public. Weller's notes state, "She spoke as if reading from a book already written, her voice even, eyes unfocused, no hesitation." Other officers reported similar experiences. A constable from Marblehead recalled Eleanor answering questions before he could ask them, her responses eerie in their precision. When he asked how she could possibly know the names of victims in cases that hadn't been released, she simply said, "Because they called me first." These words unsettled the entire investigative team. They began to wonder whether Eleanor was involved not through physical means, but through some inexplicable connection to the crimes themselves, a conduit rather than a culprit. Her most disturbing interaction came during an interview in late 1903, when police were investigating the so-called Tallow Street murder, another killing described in one of her unpublished drafts. The victim, a local butcher, had been found in his shop with candles lit in a perfect circle around him. The police visited Eleanor to confront her with this uncanny resemblance. According to Sergeant Elias Ward's report, she greeted them before they had even knocked on her door. She said, "You've come too late. He's already cold." Indeed, the man's body had been found just hours before, news the officers hadn't yet received. When asked how she knew, Eleanor allegedly replied, "Because the room went dark at dawn." There were also stories from townspeople who swore she could recount events of crimes that had never appeared in the press. One widow, Mrs. Caroline Boyd, claimed Eleanor described her husband's final moments in exact detail weeks after his unexplained disappearance. She even mentioned the broken cufflink found beside his grave, a detail known only to the police. Mrs. Boyd fainted during the encounter and refused to speak of Eleanor again. What made these accounts more unnerving was Eleanor's demeanor. She never seemed frightened or defensive. Rather, she behaved like an observer describing someone else's tragedy. The police noted her flat affect, her lack of curiosity about the murders themselves, as though she had already accepted them as inevitable. One officer wrote that she seemed to carry the weight of knowledge not yet earned. Another claimed that her presence made the air heavy and listening. Rumors spread quickly through Essex County that Eleanor was a witch, a medium, or something worse. When law enforcement returned to question her again in 1904, they brought a priest with them. The priest, Father O'Rourke, later testified that he felt a presence in the room not her own. He described the air growing cold, the candle beside her flickering without wind, and Eleanor's eyes rolling slightly upward as if she were listening to a distant voice. Then she whispered, "You'll find another by the bridge. It's not over." The following morning, a fisherman discovered a body beneath the Marblehead Bridge, matching her words exactly. After that, even hardened investigators refused to speak with her alone. Her house became a kind of forbidden place among locals, a spot children dared each other to approach at night. Some officers believed she possessed psychic ability. Others suspected something more sinister, that she was summoning these visions herself and that her writing somehow invited them into existence. The case files grew thick with contradictions, reports written in shaky handwriting, interviews cut short, statements redacted or lost. But across every account ran the same chilling refrain, that Eleanor Vance did not merely know the details of death. She seemed to be waiting for them, as if her knowledge arrived first, and reality only followed afterward. Eleanor Vance's disappearance in October 1904 remains one of the most chilling literary mysteries in American history, a vanishing act that blurred the boundary between fiction and life in ways no one could later explain. By that autumn, she was living alone in her coastal cottage outside Ipswich, a small house surrounded by salt marshes and wind-bent reeds. Neighbors had grown used to her nocturnal habits, the flicker of candlelight long after midnight, the faint sound of her reading aloud to an unseen listener, and the rhythmic scratching of her pen. But during the final weeks of her life, several witnesses reported changes in her behavior. She was seen walking barefoot along the shoreline at dusk, murmuring phrases from her new manuscript, something she referred to as the pale serpent. One fisherman recalled her telling him, "I must finish before they come for me." The manuscript was found weeks later on her desk, the ink still wet on its final page. Its last entry described a woman who wakes to find her own reflection missing from the mirror, only to hear her name being whispered from beneath the floorboards. The writing stopped mid-sentence as though interrupted. On the same page, written faintly in the margin, were the words, "They are here. What unsettled investigators most was the scene it depicted in the final chapter, a woman being dragged through a marsh by figures without faces, her body lost in the reeds as dawn approached." The date written beneath the passage was October 13th, 1904, the very day Eleanor was last seen alive. That morning, her neighbor, Mrs. Lowell, noticed Eleanor's front door standing open and her candle still burning on the table inside, its wax pooled into a strange spiral pattern. Her boots remained by the hearth. A single teacup sat on the windowsill, the tea inside cold. Outside, faint footprints led away from the cottage toward the marshes but vanished into the soft ground before reaching the water. The tide was unusually high that day, and for weeks afterward townsfolk combed the shoreline, finding nothing but a torn scrap of fabric later identified as the cuff of Eleanor's writing sleeve. The rest of her body, belongings, and manuscripts was gone. When authorities searched her home, they found something even more unnerving. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in her study were pages from The Pale Serpent that did not match the manuscript on her desk. These fragments appeared to continue the story beyond its last known sentence, describing a watcher behind the lamp and the sound of her own hand moving without command. The handwriting, however, was different, still elegant but slightly slanted, as though imitating her style imperfectly. Forensic analysis decades later confirmed that the ink used on those pages was manufactured after 1904, suggesting they had been added much later. Yet the paper itself was consistent with her original stock, a brand discontinued before her disappearance. Rumors spread quickly through Essex County. Some claimed Eleanor had drowned herself in the marsh, consumed by guilt or madness. Others insisted she'd been taken by whatever force she claimed dictated her stories. A fisherman swore he saw a woman walking along the mudflats at dawn days after she vanished, her dress wet to the waist, eyes blank as she stared toward the sea. When he called out to her, she simply turned and disappeared into the fog. The legend of her final manuscript deepened when scholars reopened her case in the 1950s. Inside, a university archive box mislabeled Unknown Author, 19th Century. Researchers discovered a complete version of The Pale Serpent. Strangely, this version contained an ending that no one had seen before. A chapter describing a woman who returns home after her own disappearance, unseen by the living but forever writing, her pages multiplying on their own. The final line read, "The story goes on, even without me." Experts authenticated most of the text as Eleanor's handwriting, but could not identify who had completed the final sections. To this day, the location of Eleanor's remains is unknown. The marsh where she disappeared is now overgrown, the foundations of her cottage long collapsed. Locals say that on foggy nights you can still see a faint light flickering in the reeds, a single candle glowing where her house once stood. Archivists who've handled her manuscripts claim to hear faint scratching between the pages, as if someone, or something, were still writing. Those who study her final work often leave it unfinished, fearing that to read it all the way through is to be written into it. When modern literary forensics revisited Eleanor Vance's work in the late 20th century, the findings unsettled even the most skeptical historians. For decades, her novels had been dismissed as eccentric curiosities, fragments of Gothic melodrama wrapped in superstition. But in 1996, a group of researchers at Yale University began a project to analyze early 20th century manuscripts using spectrographic ink analysis and fiber dating. Among the documents submitted for study was a damaged collection of Vance's writings, including The Pale Serpent, believed to be the last manuscript she ever touched. What they discovered suggested that someone or something had continued her work long after her death. The team's first discovery was technical but astonishing. Several pages of The Pale Serpent had been written using ink that wasn't commercially available until at least 1912, 8 years after Eleanor disappeared. Yet the same pages bore faint impressions of her original handwriting beneath the newer text, as if someone had traced over her words rather than replaced them. Under ultraviolet light, ghostly remnants of earlier sentences appeared, phrases that did not exist in the published or surviving versions of her novel. One recurring line read, "She doesn't stop writing even when the light goes out." The analysts were baffled. The layering of ink suggested that parts of the manuscript had been altered multiple times by different hands, none identifiable by known handwriting samples from her contemporaries. As researchers delved deeper, they found strange anomalies in the paper itself. Microscopic fibers embedded in certain pages did not match any American paper mill records from the early 1900s. They bore the composition of pulp used in Britain during the 1920s, suggesting that additional sections had been inserted years later, possibly overseas. Yet the handwriting, even in those portions, still resembled Eleanor's looping Victorian cursive, complete with her distinctive flourished E. Experts proposed the possibility of imitation, forgery, or elaborate homage, but no one could explain how the tone, structure, and diction remained consistent across decades. The text read as if authored by one continuous voice. Then came the most haunting revelation. Linguistic software used to analyze syntax and rhythm found an almost unnatural level of consistency across all of Eleanor's writings, including those supposedly added later. The program measured fluctuations in cadence, tiny patterns of pacing and emphasis that are nearly impossible to replicate consciously. The data suggested that the same cognitive signature, the same mind, had written every word, despite the chronological impossibility. It's as though her style continued evolving posthumously, one researcher noted in her field report, but in a direction that anticipates modern prose. The findings reignited public fascination with Eleanor's legacy. Conspiracy theories flourished that she had faked her own death, that a secret society of writers had taken up her unfinished work, that her manuscripts had become vessels through which she, or whatever had once spoken through her, continued to write. Paranormal enthusiasts were quick to claim proof of automatic writing from beyond the grave. Skeptics countered that the phenomenon could be explained by later editors or hoaxers, but there was one fact neither camp could deny. Every attempt to separate Eleanor's original words from the later editions produced only confusion, as if the text resisted division. Her manuscripts behaved less like fixed artifacts and more like living documents, rewriting themselves each time they were studied. Archivists handling the Pale Serpent reported eerie experiences, words appearing faintly overnight that had not been visible before, phrases smudging and reforming under lamplight. A conservator once described hearing a faint scratching sound emanating from the box where the manuscript was stored. Another found a single fresh sentence in ink when the document had been sealed for months. Don't read aloud. The lab could never replicate or explain the occurrence. By the early 2000s, the manuscripts were transferred to a controlled facility at Yale's Beinecke Library, where they remain under restricted access. Scholars permitted to view them describe an overwhelming sense of presence in the room, as if the pages themselves were aware of being observed. Some believe the writing continues to shift in subtle ways. A comma here, a word replaced there, changes no one recalls making. Each new transcription differs slightly from the last, as though Eleanor's voice is still editing her own story, shaping it to fit a future she somehow foresaw. In the end, the forensic findings did not close the mystery, they expanded it. What began as an investigation into ink and handwriting became a confrontation with something stranger. The idea that Eleanor Vance's stories might not have ended with her death. Every attempt to define where her writing stopped and the unknown began only deepened the question that haunted her life, whether she had been author, witness, or conduit. The manuscripts remain locked in their glass case, but archivists claim that every time a visitor stands before them, a faint indentation appears along the edge of the final page, as if pressed by an invisible hand still reaching for the pen. If you're still here, staring into the silence Eleanor Vance left behind, ask yourself, was she simply a forgotten writer who fell victim to madness? Or a voice that refused to die, writing through anyone who dared to open her books? Somewhere, locked in a Yale vault, her pages are said to shift ever so slightly when no one's watching. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe her final story hasn't finished yet, and won't until you read it. If mysteries like this draw you in, the kind that blend history, obsession, and the thin line between genius and the supernatural, then join us. Subscribe, step deeper into the archive, and let us show you the darker side of what history tried to erase. And tell us in the comments, do you believe Eleanor predicted the murders? Or caused them? Each story we uncover leaves behind a question that history never answered. Perhaps one day you'll be the one who finally does. Until then, keep your light burning low, your books locked tight, and remember, not every writer stops when the pen runs dry.